The ballroom smelled like cut flowers and warm bread, and somewhere under that, faintly, like the cold air off the ice sculpture by the bar, 200 chairs, white linen, a band on a low stage tuning down between songs. My brother had gotten married that afternoon in a stone church across town, and now we were all here, at the tail end of the dinner, in that soft hour when the speeches are mostly done and people start to loosen their collars. I was at the head table in a dress I did not own. My mother had picked it out, deep green, long sleeves, a neckline that made me feel like I was borrowing someone else's evening. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I had learned to sit very still in rooms. It is a skill like any other. You practice it until it holds. Craig looked happy. That was the thing I kept coming back to. My little brother, 34 years old, looking at his new wife, like the rest of the room, had gone soft at the edges. Megan had a laugh you could find across a crowd. They were good together. I had flown in 2 days early to help, and I had spent those 2 days doing what I always did at these things, which was to be useful and quiet and easy to forget. My father was 3 seats down, and he had reached the part of the evening where he stopped drinking to be polite and started drinking to be seen. I had been at this 2 days already, in the run-up. That is what I did at family events. I made myself useful. I had picked up Megan's grandmother from the airport because no one else had the afternoon free. I had run the seating cards to the venue. I had steamed a wrinkle out of my mother's jacket in a hotel bathroom at 7 in the morning. I was good at all of it, the quiet logistics, the being reliable, the disappearing into the work of a thing so that other people could enjoy it. It is the same muscle I use professionally if you want to know the truth. The being calm and useful while the important things happen around you. I just usually got paid in something other than being forgotten. Nobody at that reception knew what I did for a living. Megan's side certainly did not. My own side thought they knew and were wrong. I had shaken a lot of hands that weekend and answered the question about my work with the smallest true thing I could find, which was, I work for the Army, and let people assume whatever they assumed, which was usually something administrative, because a woman in a green dress helping with seating cards does not read, to most people, as the person who decides whether you keep your arm. So when my father stood up and tapped his glass, I did not brace as hard as I should have. I thought it was going to be an ordinary night of being small. I had no idea it was going to be the night the two halves of my life finally collided in the same room. I want to be fair to him even now. Harlan Sutton built things with his hands for 40 years. Additions, decks, a whole street of houses on the north side of town. He came up in a world where a man's worth was the callus on his palm and the invoice he could hand you at the end of a job. He raised us on that. Work is the thing you can hold. Everything else is talk. He tapped his glass with a fork. The sound cut through the band's tuning. Heads turned. He liked that. He had always liked that. I want to say a couple things, he said, standing, swaying just slightly, one hand flat on the tablecloth for balance. About my son, and this family. There was a warm murmur. People lifted their glasses. He talked about Craig for a while. The good stuff. How hard he worked at the dealership. How he had bought his first truck with his own money at 19. How he never asked for a handout. My father loved that phrase. Never asked for a handout. He used it like a medal he could pin on people. And then, the way he always did, he found me. Now my daughter, he said. And the room did that little thing rooms do when a speech turns, leaning in. My daughter Claire, she could not be more different from her brother. I felt it coming the way you feel weather. Don't let the dress fool you, he said, and he smiled, and a few people laughed before they even knew what the joke was. She's never held a job. Not a real one. We pay for everything. The laugh that went around the room was thin, uncertain, the kind of laugh people give when they are not sure if the mean thing was supposed to be mean. I did not move. I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing I could do in that room was defend myself. Defense was blood in the water. If I explained, he would perform, not understanding. If I got angry, I was dramatic. If I laughed along, I was agreeing. There was no move on that board that did not end with me smaller than I started. So I had stopped playing it. I kept my hands folded and my face level, and I let the moment pass over me, like a wave you have decided not to fight. My mother, next to him, looked at her plate. Carol Sutton had spent 40 years looking at her plate at exactly these moments. It was not that she agreed with him. It was that peace, in our family, had always been my mother's whole religion, and peace cost whatever it cost, and usually it cost me. Craig, at the center of the head table, laughed a beat too late and then looked like he regretted it. Megan's smile had gone stiff. She pushes paper at a hospital, my father went on, warming to it, gesturing at me with his glass. Some kind of clipboard situation. Very important clipboards. More laughter, easier now because he had made it a bit and bits are safe. Meanwhile, her brother here has built something real. With his hands. That is what I am proud of. That is what work looks like. I looked at the tablecloth. There was a small stain near my fork, red wine, dried to brown. I looked at that and I counted my breaths, and I waited for it to be over. It usually took less than a minute. He would land the plane, everyone would clap for Craig, the band would start, and the evening would go on, and in the morning it would be one more thing I did not talk about. But it did not go on. Because 3 tables to my right, a man set down his fork. I noticed him because everyone else was looking at my father, and he was looking at me. He was maybe 35, dark hair cut short, a jaw that had not shaved close enough that morning. He had a good suit on that did not quite fit him in the shoulders, the way a suit does not fit a man who is built for something other than suits. He had stopped eating. He was staring at my face with an expression I could not read, and then, all at once, could. It is a specific thing, watching someone remember you. Recognition arrives in the eyes first. There is a stillness, and then a widening, and then the whole face reorganizes around a fact. He reached across his own body with one hand and pushed his sleeve up, past the wrist, past the forearm, up over the elbow. And he looked down at his own arm, at whatever was there, and then back up at me. And I understood, in the space of one breath, exactly who he was and exactly what night we were both suddenly standing in. He stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood, one sleeve shoved up to the elbow, in the middle of my brother's wedding reception, while 200 people slowly realized that something had shifted in the room and turned to find the source. My father, not understanding, still riding the last of his applause, squinted at him and gave a small, confused chuckle. "What's your problem, friend?" he said. "Let me pull us out of that room for a minute. I will bring us back, but you need to know some things first, and the man standing 3 tables away is going to wait for us. He has waited a long time already. People think steadiness is something you are born with, a temperament, a gift. It is not. It is a thing you build, one hard day at a time until it becomes the shape of you. I know exactly where I built mine. My name is Claire Sutton. In that ballroom, I was 42 years old, and to everyone at those tables, I was the daughter who pushed paper. But 5 days a week, in a life none of them had ever seen, I was a surgeon. A major in the United States Army Medical Corps. A trauma surgeon, which is a particular animal. It means that when the worst day of a stranger's life comes through a set of double doors on a gurney, mine are the hands that go in. I do not tell people that at parties. I am not being modest when I say it does not come up. It genuinely does not come up, because the version of me that shows up to family things is not the version that stands at a table at 0200 with a person's blood to the wrists, deciding what stays and what goes. Those 2 women do not travel together. One of them my family had never met. I had wanted to be a doctor since I was a girl, and I had wanted it quietly because in my house, wanting things quietly was safer than wanting them out loud. My father did not believe in doctors the way he did not believe in lawyers or professors or anyone whose work did not leave a mark you could see. Talk, he called it. Clipboard work. I heard that phrase so many times growing up that it stopped stinging and started just being true. The way a thing your father says over and over becomes a law of physics in your body, whether it is accurate or not. I paid my own way through college. 2 jobs. I paid for medical school the way a lot of us do, who do not come from money and will not ask for it. I signed up. The Army put me through school, and in return I owed the Army years, and I paid those years gladly because the Army did something my family never had. It looked at my hands and saw what they could do. It did not ask me to be smaller. It asked me to be exactly as capable as I was, and then it asked for more, and I found out I had more. That is the thing that is hard to explain to people who have never been underestimated at home. When someone finally expects everything of you, it does not feel like pressure. It feels like being seen. It feels like coming up for air. Let me tell you what my ordinary week actually looked like, the one my father called clipboard work. I ran a trauma service at an Army medical center. That means I was the person they called when the double doors banged open and the medics came in fast and loud with someone whose body had just been through something it was not built to survive. Car wrecks, falls, the training accidents that happen when you ask young people to do dangerous things for a living. And some weeks, the ones who came back from far away in worse shape than anyone wanted to say out loud. There's a rhythm to it that people who have not done it cannot picture. It is very loud for about 90 seconds, and then, if you are any good, it goes very quiet because everyone finds their job and does it. And the loudest thing in the room becomes the monitor and your own voice, low and even, calling the next thing and the next thing. I have a voice I use in there. It does not go up. It does not speed up. I learned early that a room takes its heart rate from the surgeon. And if my voice climbs, everyone's hands climb with it. And climbing hands kill people. So I keep it down. I keep it flat. I have had residents tell me years later that they still hear it, that flat voice, when they are scared in their own operating rooms. That is the only monument I will ever build. A voice in someone else's head telling them to slow down. You have time. Do the next right thing. I have stood at a table with my hands inside a person, holding a life in the most literal way that phrase can mean, while my phone sat in a locker with a text from my father on it asking if I could chip in on a gift for someone. Because Claire is doing fine, Claire has it easy. I never resented the texts. I want to be clear about that. I resented that there were two of me, and the one my family knew was the smaller, thinner, made-up one, and the one who did the work they would never see was a stranger to the people who shared my name. That is the loneliest arithmetic I know. To be most yourself in the exact place the people who raised you will never look. I do not want you to think I was a martyr about it. I was not. I loved my work, all of it, even the parts that cost me sleep, and I had built a life around it that was full and good. Colleagues who knew exactly what I was. Soldiers I had trained who would have followed me anywhere. A version of myself I liked and trusted. The loneliness was not the whole picture. It was a seam that ran through an otherwise solid thing. But seams are where things fail, and the seam in me ran right down the middle, between the woman who was respected by everyone who saw her actual work, and the woman who sat at her family's table and got called a freeloader, and I had spent a lot of years, carefully, never letting those two women stand in the same room, because I was afraid of what would happen when they did. I had a feeling it would not be graceful. I was right. It was not graceful at all. It was 200 people at a wedding, and a man rolling up his sleeve and my father's face coming apart. But some things have to break before they can be true, and the seam in me had needed to break for a very long time. I just never imagined it would break at Craig's wedding, over a slice of cake, because of a scar I had put on a stranger's arm 9 years before in a country none of these people could find on a map. By the time of my brother's wedding, I had been in for a long stretch of my adult life. I had done a general surgery residency at an Army medical center. 5 years. The kind of 5 years that rearranges what you think a human being can survive. I had trained on forward surgical work, the compressed, brutal discipline of doing damage control in a tent with the power flickering and the supply chain a rumor. And in the spring of 2017, I had deployed with a forward surgical team to a combat theater, and I had found out what I was actually made of. I stood in that ballroom in a borrowed green dress, and I let my father tell a room I had never worked a day in my life. And the truth was that I had done more work in a single night, one specific night 9 years earlier, than most people do in a decade. I just never talked about it. I had a whole cathedral of a life that none of them had ever set foot in, and I had built it on the far side of a door I never invited them through. Partly to protect it, and partly, if I am honest, because I had stopped believing they would want to come. The creed came from my father, and my father got it from his, and probably that man got it from his, all the way back to whatever cold farm the Suttons came off of. Real work leaves marks on your hands. If your hands are soft at the end of the day, you did not work, you talked. I grew up inside that sentence. My father was not a cruel man in the way that word usually means. He was up before light. He never missed a mortgage payment or a little league game. He would give a neighbor a Saturday and not take $1 for it. But he had one measure for a human being, and he applied it to everyone. And the people who did not measure up on it were, in his eyes, getting away with something. Getting a free ride, living off the rest of us who did the holding. I did not measure up. I was the kid with her nose in a book, the one who flinched at the table, saw and loved the wrong things. I remember being maybe 10, and him crouching down to show me a callus on his palm, thick as a coin, and telling me, not unkindly, "You do not know what a day's work is until your hands tell you about it at night." He meant it as wisdom. He was handing me the family religion. And I remember looking at my own small, soft hands and understanding that whatever I turned out to be, it was going to have to be something that showed. The thing about a story a family tells about you is that it is load-bearing. Once it is up, everyone leans on it. It holds the weight of 100 small interactions. It saves everyone the trouble of looking again. By the time I was in my 30s, the story had set like concrete. Claire does something with paperwork at a hospital. Claire plays doctor. Claire is fine, she gets by, we help her out. None of it was true. I never took $1 from them in my adult life. But I never corrected it either, and that is the part I have had to sit with. I let it stand. At holidays, when an aunt asked what I did, and my father answered for me before I could open my mouth, I let his answer be the answer. It was easier to let them be wrong than to make them uncomfortable with the truth. I told myself that restraint was a kind of grace, and some of it was, but some of it was just tired. Some of it was a woman who had been correcting the record her whole life and had finally decided the record was not worth the fight. There was one Thanksgiving I think about more than the others. I was maybe 36. I had flown in from a rotation, still half on the other side of the world in my head, still seeing things behind my eyes that I did not bring to the dinner table, because you do not bring those to a dinner table. An aunt asked me over the turkey what it was I did again, exactly. And before I could answer, my father answered for me. He said, "Oh, Claire does the paperwork side of the hospital, scheduling, that kind of thing. Somebody has to." And he said it warmly. That was the thing. He was not trying to wound me. In his mind, he was covering for me, sparing me the trouble of explaining a small job, being kind. And I sat there with a fork in my hand, 3 weeks removed from the hardest work a human being can do. And I opened my mouth, and then I closed it. Because I did the calculation I always did. If I corrected him, the table would go quiet and strange. My mother would get that pinched look. My father would either argue or, worse, get quietly hurt that I had shown him up in front of his sister. It would cost the whole afternoon. And for what? So that an aunt I saw once a year would know the truth about a life she was not really asking about. So I said, yeah, somebody has to. And I passed the potatoes, and I hated myself a little in a way I had gotten so used to that I barely noticed it anymore, the way you stop hearing a highway you live next to. That is the trap of it. Every single time, in the moment, silence is the cheaper choice. It is only when you add up 20 years of moments that you see what silence actually cost, which was that the people who loved me went to their graves, some of them never knowing who I was. My grandmother died believing I'd do hospital scheduling. I let her. I will carry that one for the rest of my life. They built a smaller version of me year after year, and the worst part, the part I did not want to look at, was that I had handed them most of the bricks. Now I have to tell you about the man standing by his table, because he is the reason the story turned, and he did not turn it on purpose. He turned it just by being alive, which he was not supposed to be. His name was Reed Coleman. In that ballroom, I did not know his name. That is the strange, hard center of this whole thing. I had held his life in my 2 hands for the better part of a night, and I had never known what to call him, and he had never known what to call me, because when I met him, he was a set of injuries and a blood pressure and a decision, and I was a pair of eyes above a mask telling him to stay with me. He was a friend of my brother's. That was the coincidence, if you want to call it that. I have stopped calling things coincidences. Craig had gotten into hunting a few years back, joined a group, and a lot of the men in that group were veterans, and Reed was one of them. He had been an infantry sergeant. He had done the kind of soldiering that my kind of soldiering exists to clean up after. And in the spring of 2017, on a day when a convoy came apart on a road it should not have, he had been loaded onto a helicopter with an arm that the medics who put him on it did not expect to see stay attached to him. That arm came to me. I will tell you the whole of that night later, because you should hear it the way it happened. But for now, understand this. Reed Coleman had spent 9 years not knowing the name of the surgeon who saved his arm. He remembered almost nothing of that night. Anesthesia and shock take the memory the way a tide takes a sandcastle. But he remembered one thing. He told me later he remembered it the way you remember the one clear frame in a dream. A pair of eyes over a surgical mask, and a voice, low and even, telling him to stay with her. He had gone looking for those eyes for years. Veterans do that. There is a debt that has no address, and it eats at you, the not being able to say thank you to the specific person. He had written to the hospital. He had gotten the kind of answer you get, which is no answer, privacy rules, records we cannot confirm. He had made a certain peace with never knowing. Craig told me all of this afterward, filling in the parts I could not have known. Reed had joined the hunting group about 4 years back when he moved to the area for a job. He did not talk much about his service, the way the ones who saw the worst of it usually do not. But once, on a cold morning in a blind, he had rolled up his sleeve to show Craig the scar and told him a piece of the story, the short version, the version that ends with, "And some army surgeon I never met saved it." Craig had heard that story. My own brother had heard a man describe, in general terms, the exact thing I did, and it had never once occurred to him that the surgeon in the story might be his sister, because in the story he carried around about me, I did paperwork. The myth was so complete that it edited the evidence out in real time. He had literally been told about my work by the man whose life I saved, and his brain had filed it under some army surgeon, a stranger, because Claire could not possibly be that. That is what a story does when it sets hard enough. It does not just ignore the truth. It rewrites the truth into something that fits, right in front of you, and you never feel it happen. So Reed came to the wedding of a man he hunted with. He wore his one good suit. He did not know the groom had a sister who was a soldier because it had never come up, because in this family it never came up. He sat down at a table with a piece of cake, an ordinary guest at an ordinary wedding, carrying a 9-year-old debt he had given up on ever paying. And then a man he hunted with got married, and he came to the reception, and he sat at a table with a slice of cake in front of him. And across the room, the father of the groom stood up and pointed at a woman in a green dress and called her a freeloader who had never worked a day in her life. And Reed Coleman looked at that woman's face. And he heard a voice in his memory say, "Stay with me." And he understood, all at once, in the middle of a wedding, that the eyes he had been looking for 9 years were sitting 20 feet away, being told she was nothing. He did not know my name. He knew my hands. Back in the ballroom, the silence had teeth now. Reed was on his feet. My father was looking at him with the loose, cheerful belligerence of a man who has been interrupted mid-performance and has not yet decided to be angry about it. The band had stopped tuning, the waiters had stopped moving. 200 people were doing the arithmetic of a room, feeling that something was wrong before they could name it. My father did what my father always did when he lost the thread. He grabbed for a bigger laugh. "Sit down, buddy. You're all right," he said, waving his glass. Then he turned back to the tables, to his audience, and he found me again because I was the reliable joke, the one that always landed. "See, this is what I mean. Even her friends are strange." He grinned. "Claire, honey, go on. Tell everybody what you actually do all day. Tell them. Enlighten us." There it was, the invitation that was a trap. Tell them, in front of everyone, and either say the small false thing and confirm his story, or say the true thing and be the woman who made a scene at her brother's wedding, who could not just let her father have his moment, who had to make it about herself. I knew that trap. I had been walking around it my whole life, and I felt every old instinct fire at once. Make it smaller, deflect, say something self-deprecating, take the hit so the day can go on. I looked at Craig, at his face, at the wedding I did not want to break. I looked at Megan in her white dress. I looked at my mother, who had lifted her eyes from her plate at last and was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her before, something between fear and a plea, and I could not tell if she was begging me to stay quiet or begging me not to. Every instinct I had was to make it small, to swallow it one more time, to protect the evening at my own cost, which was the only cost I had ever been asked to pay, and which I had always paid without complaint. I had gotten very good at taking the hit. It was, I sometimes thought, the thing I was best at outside an operating room. For one more second, I almost did what I always did. And then I looked at Reed Coleman, and I stopped. I did not know his name yet, but I knew his face now, the way he knew mine. 9 years fell away. I knew that jaw with a breathing tube taped across it. I knew that arm. I had a map of that arm in my hand still, the way you keep the muscle memory of a thing you fought hard for. And I looked at him standing there, this man who was alive because of a night I never spoke about, and I understood something very simply, the way you understand things when the noise finally drops out. I was not going to lie for my father anymore. That is the whole of the decision. It sounds bigger than it was. I did not decide to humiliate him. I did not decide to make a speech, or to win, or to finally, after 42 years, put the old man in his place. I have watched people do that, and it never looks the way they hoped. I just decided to stop covering. To take my hands off the false version of me that I had been holding upright my whole life, and let it fall, and see what it had been hiding. I set down my napkin. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I just uncrossed my hands and put them flat on the table, the way I put them flat on a rail before I scrub in. And I looked at the man across the room and I gave him the smallest nod. Permission. Recognition. Go ahead. I have thought a lot about that nod, because it was the whole turn of my life in one small motion, and I want to be honest about what was in it. It was not courage, exactly. It was more like surrender, the good kind. I had spent 42 years holding a door shut between my two lives, and holding a door shut takes constant strength. You just stop noticing the strain because it becomes the baseline of who you are. And in that second, I simply stopped holding it. I took my weight off the door. And I braced for the flood, for the noise, for whatever came through. And I found that under the fear there was something I had not felt at a family gathering in my entire adult life, which was relief. The relief of a person who is finally going to be seen whole, whatever it costs, because carrying yourself in two pieces is heavier than carrying yourself in one. And I was so tired, and I had been tired for so long that I had forgotten tired was not the same thing as normal. Reed's voice, when it came, was not steady. This is a man who had been shot at for a living, and his voice shook. "Ma'am," he said, and then he stopped and started again, because he needed to get it right. The spring of 2017, the forward surgical team outpassed the district center, the day the whole convoy came in at once. He swallowed. "That was you. Those were your eyes. I would know them anywhere. I have been trying to find them for 9 years. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice shift in the sculpture by the bar. I looked at him, and I said the only thing there was left to say, the thing I had never said out loud to anyone in my family in 20 years. Yes, I said. That was me. What happened next didn't happen fast, and it did not happen loud, and that is why I think it landed the way it did. Loud things you can dismiss. Quiet things get inside." Reed came around his table, slowly. He was not a man who moved fast in a room full of civilians. He came to the open floor in front of the head table, and he rolled his sleeve the rest of the way up, all the way to the shoulder, and he turned his forearm out so the room could see it. The scar ran from just below his elbow, almost to his wrist. Long, wide in places where the tissue had been opened to let the pressure out and then closed again over many surgeries. It was the kind of scar people look away from at a pool. It was the kind of scar I had put on 100 arms and legs to save the limb underneath. Because a scar is a trade, and the trade is a good one, and the person gets to keep the arm. "I was a sergeant," Reed said to the room, not to me. His voice found its floor and held there. "Infantry. 9 years ago, a roadside bomb took our vehicle apart on a road we drove every day. I do not remember most of it. I remember the medics working on my arm, and I remember one of them, a kid, telling another one it was gone. They would take it at the hospital. I remember thinking, all right, I can live with one arm." He turned the arm a little so the light caught it. They flew me to a surgical team in a tent. And there was a surgeon there who looked at an arm 3 medics had already written off. And instead of taking it, she said, "And I have been told this since," she said, "not yet." She said not yet for about 6 hours. She rebuilt the artery. She cleaned it out more times than anybody wanted to. She stayed on it through a night when there were more people coming in than there were hands to work on them, and she did not give up on one sergeant's arm, even though giving up would have been the reasonable call and nobody would have blamed her. He looked at me then, and his eyes were wet, and he did not care. "They wanted to take the arm," he said. "She spent the night saying not yet. I can pick up my daughter with this hand because of the woman your family just called a freeloader." He held the arm up a moment longer so nobody could pretend they had not seen it. Then he lowered it, and the whole room seemed to lower with it. 200 people letting out a breath at the same time. I had spent 9 years never talking about that night. And here it was, being read back to me across a wedding by the one person on earth who had the standing to read it. In a plain, flat voice, with no performance in it at all. That is the thing that got me. Reed was not making a speech. He was not trying to shame my father. He was just a man telling the truth about the worst and most important day of his life. And the truth happened to have my hands in it. I felt my own eyes go hot, and I did not let them spill, because I had a lifetime of practice at not spilling, and because if I broke, the room would make the moment about my feelings, and it was not about my feelings. It was about a fact that had finally walked into the room on its own 2 legs and refused to sit back down. No, nobody laughed. Nobody moved. And then, at a table near the back, an older man stood up. I did not know him either. I learned afterward that his name was Vernon Poole, that he was on the bride's side, an uncle of Megan's or a family friend, and that he had spent 30 years in the army and retired as a command sergeant major, which is a rank that means he had spent his life around exactly the kind of thing Reed was describing and knew precisely what it weighed. He stood the way old soldiers stand, slow and square, and he buttoned his jacket, and he spoke in a voice that had given a lot of orders in its time and did not need to be raised to fill a room. "Folks," he said, "I want to help you understand what you are looking at, because I do not think most of you can, and that is not your fault." He nodded toward me. That is a combat surgeon. A forward surgical team is 4 or 5 people in a tent, as close to the fighting as medicine gets. And their whole job is the hour after the worst thing happens. The hour that decides whether a man goes home to his family or goes home in a box. It is the hardest job I know of in that whole army, and I have seen most of them. He paused. If I am reading this right, and I have been reading uniforms for 40 years, that is a major, and if she has the ribbon I think she has for that rotation this young man is describing, then there are people in this room's country, tonight, asleep in their beds, who are only alive because of her. That is the job. That is the whole job. Nobody does it for the money, and nobody does it for the thanks, because they never get either. He looked at my father, not unkindly, just squarely. "Sir, I do not know you, and I mean no disrespect at your son's wedding. But you have been telling this room your daughter never worked a day in her life." He let that sit. "I would give a great deal to have worked one day as hard as her ordinary Tuesday." And then, around the room, they started to stand. Not everyone. It was not a movie. But at scattered tables, men and a few women got to their feet, quietly, the way you stand for something when standing is the only word your body has. I found out later most of them had served. They knew what Reed had said, and what Vernon had said, the way you know your own language when you hear it in a foreign airport. They stood. My father looked around the room for the joke. For the punchline that would put it all back the way it was, put him back on top of it, make it a bit again, safe again. He looked, and there was nothing there. There had never been a punchline. There had only ever been me, and a story he liked better than me. And now the story was on the floor in pieces, and the room was on its feet, and the only person at the head table, still sitting down, was the man who had spent 40 years building me small. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. People always want that part. I did not. I felt a lot of things standing up out of that chair at last in my mother's green dress, but triumph was not one of them. Mostly I felt a strange, aching quiet, like the quiet after a long case when the bleeding is finally controlled, and you realize how tired you are, how tired you have been for hours without letting yourself know it. My father sat there. He had gone a color I did not like. I have spent my life watching faces change color, and I moved toward him before I even decided to. The old reflex, because whatever else he was 68, and he had just had the ground go out from under him in public. But he was not having a medical event. He was having a human one. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my whole life, I watched my father not know what to say to me. "How was I supposed to know?" he said finally, quiet, not for the room, for me. "You never said anything." And that was true. That was the terrible, complicated truth of it. I never said anything. I had let his version stand for 20 years because fighting it cost more than I had wanted to spend. He was not wrong that I had been silent. But we both heard in the same second that it was not the point. A father is supposed to be curious about his child. He is supposed to look at her twice. He is supposed to wonder, at least once in 20 years, whether the small story he is telling might be too small. He never wondered. He never asked me a single real question about my life. The not knowing was not an accident that happened to him. It was a thing he chose, a little every day, by preferring the version that let him feel like the one who did the holding. "You never asked," I said. "Not cruel, just true." "In 20 years, Dad, you never once asked." He did not have an answer for that. I do not think there is one. I have turned that exchange over many times since, looking for the place where I could have been kinder, and I keep deciding I was as kind as the truth allowed. There is a version of me that would have softened it, that would have said, "It is all right, Dad. Do not feel bad," the way I had softened everything for everyone my whole life. And I did not say that because it would have been one more brick in the small version of me. One more time I made myself little so a man could feel comfortable. Kindness that erases you is not kindness. It is just a nicer name for disappearing. I had disappeared enough for one lifetime. So I let my sentence stand, plain and true and not cruel. And I let him sit in it, because sitting in the truth is the only place any real change has ever started, for him or for me or for anybody. My mother reached me before I could say anything else. She had come around the table, and she took my hand in both of hers, and she was crying in the careful way of a woman who has spent her life not making scenes and did not know how to make this one either. "I knew you were a doctor," she whispered. "I knew that much. I did not know it was. I did not know it was this." "I know, Mom," I said. "I never told you it was this." She held on to my hand, and she said a thing I have thought about a great deal since. She said, "I should have made him ask you. All those years, I should have made him ask you what you did." And she was right, and it was the closest my mother had ever come, in my whole life, to saying she had chosen the wrong side of the quiet. She had kept the peace, and the peace had been built on my back, and somewhere in her she had always known it, and that Thanksgiving arithmetic had run in her head too, every time, and she had made the same cheap choice I had. We were more alike than either of us wanted to be. That was the hard gift of the night. I looked at my mother and saw where I had learned to disappear. Around us, the room had started to move again, but differently. People I did not know were coming up to me, some of them veterans, some of them not, wanting to say something and not having the words. A man about my father's age took my hand in both of his and could not get a sentence out and just nodded and walked away with his eyes wet. A young woman told me her brother was a medic, and thank you. Megan's grandmother, the one I had picked up from the airport, the one who had watched me carry her bags and thought I was just the helpful daughter, held my face in her two papery hands and said, "You never said a word, all that drive. You let me talk the whole time about my hip." And she laughed and cried at once. Your whole life you have been letting people talk about their hips. That one undid me a little, because it was exactly right. I had spent a lifetime letting people talk about their hips. Craig stood at the center of his own wedding, in front of his new wife, looking at me like the floor had tilted. My little brother. He had grown up inside the same story I had, except from the other side of it. The side that got to be the one who worked with his hands, the good son, the real one. He was not cruel either. He had just never questioned the water he swam in. All those years, he said, why did you let us say it? Why didn't you ever just tell us? Because it was easier than being seen, I thought. Because somewhere along the line, I decided you had all made up your minds, and it was less lonely to be invisible on purpose than to be invisible by accident. Because I had a whole life that was mine, out past a door none of you ever knocked on, and I had stopped believing you wanted in. I did not say all of that. It was his wedding. But I understood, standing there, that easier had never once been a good enough reason, and that I had been telling myself a version of the truth that was every bit as small and as convenient as my father's. I should have told you, I said to Craig. That one's on me. I promised I would tell you about that night, so I will, because you cannot understand what stood up in that ballroom without it. It was the spring of 2017. I was a captain then, 33 years old, running the operating side of a forward surgical team in a place I will not name because the name does not matter, and the map does. We were a small element, a handful of us in a hardened tent with 2 operating tables and a generator that ran the lights, and a supply situation that was always 3 deliveries behind where you wanted it. Our whole reason to exist was the golden hour. The idea that if you can get a badly wounded person to real surgery inside the first hour, you can pull them back from a place they otherwise do not come back from. Most days were long and empty, and then not empty at all. That day, a convoy hit a string of buried charges on a road they ran every morning, and the radio call came in, and it was not one casualty. It was many, all at once. More than we had tables for. More than we had hands for. That is the nightmare of my kind of medicine. Not the single terrible injury. The moment there are more people who need everything than there are of you to give it. You have to do a thing called triage, which is a clean word for the worst decisions a person can make. Deciding in seconds who you work on now, who waits, and, sometimes, who you cannot help and have to set aside so that 2 others can live. I have made those decisions. They do not leave you. You carry every face. Reed came in on the second bird. His arm was destroyed below the elbow. The vessels were torn, the muscle was a ruin, and the medics who put him on the helicopter had already told him it was gone, because from where they stood, it was. But I was not standing where they stood. I had light and instruments and blood and a little bit of time. And when I looked at that arm, I saw one artery that could maybe be rebuilt, and I made a call. Not yet. We would try to save it. Not because it was the easy call. It was the hard one. It would tie up a surgeon and a table for hours in the middle of a mass casualty. But the arm was savable, and a person is not a math problem, and I had a window, so I climbed into that window and I stayed there. And it took most of the night. I lost track of how many times we went back in to clean it out. I remember the generator coughing once and the lights dropping and somebody holding a headlamp over the field until they came back. I remember a young man's blood pressure fighting me and then slowly deciding to live. And I remember his eyes, above the tube, open at one point when they should not have been, terrified. And I remember leaning down into his line of sight and telling him, in the most level voice I own, to stay with me. Stay with me. You are all right. Stay with me. I need you to understand what a night like that actually is, because the word surgery makes people picture something clean and calm and lit. And it was none of those things. It was a tent. The floor was plywood over dirt. There was a second table 4 feet from mine with another surgeon working just as hard on someone just as broken, and between us not enough of anything. Not enough blood, not enough time, not enough hands. We were calling out for units of blood we did not have, and people were rolling up their own sleeves to give it, soldiers who were done with their own shift, lining up to be walking blood banks for men they had never met. That is the thing that happens out there that nobody at home will ever know. People giving their own blood, still warm, straight into someone else's arm, an hour after a firefight, because the alternative was watching a man run out. I made decisions that night I have never fully put down. Somewhere in the middle of it, another casualty came in who I could not save, and I had to know that in about 4 seconds and turn back to the ones I could, and keep my voice flat while I did it. That is the part they do not put in the recruiting videos. Not the courage, the arithmetic, the turning away. I have a list in me of the faces I turned away from so that other faces could stay, and I will carry that list until I die. And Reed Coleman's face is on the other list, the short, bright one, the one that makes the long list survivable. So when I say I stayed on his arm through the night, understand that staying on it was a choice I made against every pressure in that tent to let it go. It was the harder call, and the right one, and I have been proven right exactly once, publicly in my entire life. And it happened at my brother's wedding, 9 years later, when the arm I saved rolled up its own sleeve and stood up for me. I never knew his name. When you work that way, they are not names. They are injuries and numbers and the whole force of your attention. He went off to the next level of care before he was ever awake enough to be a person to me. And I went on to the next table, and the next, and by the time the sun came up, I had forgotten his face inside the blur of all the faces, the way you have to, or you cannot lift your hands the next day. That was the night my father was describing 20 feet away when he told a room I had never worked a day in my life. Later, when the band had started again and the room had folded itself back around the ordinary business of a wedding, I found Reed out in the hallway by the coat check. He was leaning against the wall with his sleeve still up, like he had forgotten to fix it, holding a glass of water he was not drinking. We stood there for a while without saying much. There was not a lot that needed saying. He knew what he knew and I knew what I knew, and it turned out that was its own kind of language. "I looked for you," he said finally. "For years, I wrote the hospital. They could not tell me anything. Privacy." He almost laughed. I made my peace with never getting to say it. "You did not have to say anything," I told him. "It was the job. It was what I was there to do." "I know," he said. I still needed to say it. He looked at his arm. "I have a daughter now. She is 2. She would not exist if you had taken the easy call that night." He said it plainly, the way you can only say the largest things. "I want you to know that. I have been carrying it around for 9 years with nowhere to put it. Tonight I finally got to put it down. I have been thanked before. It is not a thing that happens often in my work, because usually by the time someone is well enough to thank you, they are far away, and you are a blur to them too. But I have been thanked. This was not like the other times. This was a man handing me back a piece of my own life that I had folded up and stored in the dark, because the people who were supposed to hold it for me had decided it was not worth holding. "Thank you," I said, "for standing up. You did not have to do that in front of all those people." He shrugged, the small shrug of a man who genuinely did not understand there had been a choice. "Ma'am," he said, "you spent a whole night refusing to give up on me. Standing up was the least I have ever done." We talked a while longer than that, out in that quiet hallway, with the music thudding softly through the wall. He told me about the years after. The surgeries, more than a dozen, to rebuild what my night had bought him time to keep. The therapy, the learning to use the hand again, the low stretch where he had not been sure any of it was worth it. And then the turn, meeting his wife, the job, the daughter. He got his phone out and showed me a picture of a little girl with his same stubborn jaw, and his hand shook, holding the phone, the same hand. And I looked at that hand doing an ordinary father thing, holding up a photo of his kid. And I felt something in my chest that I do not have a clean word for. It is the thing my whole profession is secretly about and almost never gets to see. You save a life, and then the life goes off and becomes a whole world of its own. Weddings and daughters and cold mornings in a hunting blind. And you almost never get to stand in the middle of that world and see what your night grew into. I got to. Once. In a hallway by a coat check. It is the closest thing to a religious experience I have ever had. I named her after my grandmother, not after you. Sorry, he said, and he almost smiled. I did not have a name to use. You do now, I said. I do now, he said. Major Sutton. My father found me in that hallway a little later, after Reed had gone back in. He came around the corner and he stopped a good 10 feet off, like there was a line on the floor he did not know how to cross. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. 68 years old, in his good suit, with his hands, those famous hands, hanging at his sides, not knowing what to do with themselves for maybe the first time in his life. I had wanted this man's respect for 42 years. I want to be honest with you about that because it is the center of everything. Not his money, not his help, not his approval of my choices. His respect. The simple thing of him looking at me and seeing someone who did work, that mattered. I had wanted it so long that the wanting had become part of my skeleton. And standing in that hallway, I finally had it. He had watched a decorated soldier tell a room I had saved his life. He had watched other veterans get to their feet for me. He could not unsee it. I had his respect at last. All of it, all at once, delivered in the most public and undeniable way I could have asked for. And I understood, standing there, that respect and closeness are not the same thing, and that I might only get to keep one of them. "I would like to hear about it," he said. His voice was rough. "Sometime, the real version of what you do." He looked at the floor. "I have been telling it wrong." "You have," I said. "I did not know." "You did not ask," I said again gently, because it was still true and it was still the whole of it. "I would have told you, Dad. Any time in 20 years. You never once asked." He nodded. He did not argue. That was new. He stood there and took it, the way I had spent a lifetime standing and taking things, and I felt no satisfaction in watching him do it. Only a tiredness, and under the tiredness, something that surprised me, which was a small, reluctant tenderness for a man who was going to have to live now inside the space where his story about me used to be. I had my name back. I was not sure yet what it had cost to take it, is a thing I wrote in a notebook that night, and it is still the truest sentence I have about all of this. The myth was gone. And the easy, unexamined thing between my father and me, the thing that had let us sit at the same table for decades without ever really meeting, that was gone too. Something honest could grow there instead, in time. But it would be years of small, hard work, and I did not know yet whether he had it in him to do it, and neither did he. I did not leave right away. That is the part I am proud of, more than the standing up. I stayed. It was Craig's wedding, and I was not going to let my own reckoning become the thing everyone remembered about his night. So I went back in. And my brother, to his enormous credit, would not let me slip to the edge of the room the way I always did. Halfway through a song, he crossed the floor and took my hand and pulled me out toward the middle where the light was. And he stopped the band with a wave, and he picked up a microphone, and my stomach dropped, because I had spent my whole life dreading exactly this. A Sutton standing up to say a thing about me in front of a room. "Sorry, everybody, one more," Craig said. I know. Last one." He looked at me. His eyes were red. "A lot of you heard some things at dinner tonight. I want to fix one of them because it is my wedding and I get to." He took a breath. "This is my sister. This is Major Claire Sutton, United States Army. She is a surgeon. She saves people's lives on the worst day of those people's lives, and she has been doing it, quietly, for as long as I have known her, and I did not know the half of it until about an hour ago, and that is my fault and my family's, not hers." His voice caught. I should have led with that my whole life. "Claire, will you dance with your idiot brother?" I did. Of course I did. And Megan hugged me on the dance floor and told me she was proud to have me in the family, and she meant the real me, the one they had all just met. And I held on to that because it was the first time in a very long time anyone in that world had said they were proud of the actual woman and not the small drawing of her. We danced, my brother and I, badly, the way siblings dance. And halfway through he leaned in and said, quiet, just for me, "I am going to be angry about this for a while. Not at you, at us, at me." And I told him that was all right, that he was allowed, that I had been angry about it for 20 years and had mostly just pointed the anger at myself. And maybe between us we could put it somewhere better. He held on a little tighter after that. My little brother, who had spent his whole life as the good son, the real one, the one whose work you could see, was going to have to reckon now with what it had cost me to be the backdrop his story got told against. That was his to carry, and I was not going to carry it for him. And that too was new for me, letting someone I loved sit with something hard instead of rushing in to make it easy. Reed found me one more time before the night was over to say goodbye and to introduce me to his wife, who did not say anything at all, just took both my hands and pressed them, the way you would hold something you had heard about your whole marriage and never expected to touch. I understood. I had been the ghost in their house for 9 years, the nameless one they thanked at Thanksgiving. Now I had a face and a rank and a borrowed green dress, and she was making sure I was real. When I finally left, near midnight, my mother walked me to the coat check with her arm through mine, holding on tighter than she needed to. My father stood a few feet off by the doors. He did not try to hug me. He knew better than to try to fix 40 years in a doorway at midnight. I would like to call you, he said. If that is all right, not about anything, just to hear how the week was. I looked at him for a moment. Maybe, I said. It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and it was the most honest thing either of us had said to each other all night, and we both knew it, and we let it be enough for one evening. I drove home in a borrowed green dress with the windows down and my shoulders back, the way I stand in the only uniform that ever really fit me. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not carrying anything I had to keep hidden. I had set it down, right there on the ballroom floor, in front of everyone. And the strange thing, the thing nobody tells you, is how light you feel afterward. How much of your strength you had been spending all those years just to hold up a version of yourself that was smaller than the truth. I want to say one thing to you before I go, because I think some of you know exactly the room I have been describing, even if yours has different furniture. Maybe the people who were supposed to see you decided a long time ago who you were, and they were wrong, and it was easier to let them be wrong than to fight it. Maybe you have a whole life they have never really looked at. Maybe you have gotten so used to being the smaller version at the table that you have started handing over the bricks yourself. Here is what I learned in a ballroom in a borrowed dress. You do not have to shout. I never shouted. Shouting would have proven their story, not mine. But you also do not have to keep building their version of you with your own two hands. You are allowed to set it down. You are allowed to stop lying for the people who never asked you the real question. And when you do, more often than you would think, the truth stands up on its own, from some corner of the room you never expected, and says what you were too tired to say. There's a thing my father used to say, that real work leaves marks on your hands. He meant it as a wall to keep people like me on the outside of. But I have come to think he was right, just not in the way he knew. My work leaves marks. It leaves them on other people. It leaves them on a sergeant's forearm, a long scar he can roll up his sleeve and show a room. It leaves them in a little girl who exists because of a decision made in a tent at 3 a.m. My hands are soft. My father was looking at the wrong hands. He should have been looking at the people I sent back into the world, still walking around, carrying the mark of my day's work on them, everywhere, all the time, where he could not see it because he never thought to look. Do the work. Let it be real. Let it leave its mark, whatever kind of mark your work leaves, seen or unseen. And when someone finally recognizes it, do not gloat and do not shrink. Just stand up straight and say, yes, that was me. Some rooms take years to catch up to who you really are. Stand like they already have.